So back to the righteous mind. How did your work on disgust lead you in that direction?
Yes, it did. It was the breakthrough because when I was a first-year grad student beginning to study moral psychology, it was all about Lawrence Kohlberg and Jean Piaget, and it was very rational, and it was about how kids' beliefs about justice and fairness change as they develop. And it was a little bit dry and dull. And it wasn't until I took a cultural psychology class with Alan Fisk, who's a brilliant cultural anthropologist and psychologist, and he had us read ethnographies, full-length treatments of cultures from around the world. And it was there that I saw these patterns, these repeated patterns around menstruation, food, taboos,
Borders.
Yeah, that's right. There are, and so that's what really showed me this. As I said, it's like a Jungian view. Like there's something in our minds that is coming out all over the world. Culture can't be just. We're not a blank slate. I wish Steve was still here. We're not blank slates. Cultures can't just teach you. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Like you can't teach that to people. That's the way we are in a family. But you can't make a whole society believe that because there are constraints. And it was studying disgust, purity, pollution, and then disgust with Paul Rosen, who happened to be at the University of Pennsylvania, where I was a graduate student. It was really studying disgust and sanctity and purity and religious practice around that. Why is the body so important in religious practice, except in modern Protestantism? And so that's what got me to look at this much more irrational stuff, to think about evolution in a certain way. And that led me to multi-level selection. So yeah, if not for disgust, I probably would have just been somebody studying relatively dry aspects of moral psychology about reasoning and fairness.
Right. That takes you down into the emotional and the instinctual level.
Exactly. That's right. Disgust is and there's a big debate in moral psychology. It's a very active, exciting field, but there are people who say, well, no, it's all about harm. Everything's ultimately about harm, and everything else is indirectly harm. And there are others who say, no, it's all about fairness. Everything is fairness. And I am an anti-parsimonist. That is, I do not believe in the pursuit of parsimony. I believe that... Well,
the problem is the terms that everything gets reduced to start to expand.
What do you mean?
Well, if you say everything is about harm, then you have to redefine harm so that it's universally. You have multiple kinds of harm. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So it does seem to be a mug's game in some sense, and it enables you to have one answer for everything, which is rarely helpful.
Yeah.
So I was reading Franz de Waal recently, and he's studied disgust I didn't realize that disgust did manifest itself in other animals so clearly.
It's controversial. There are some hints of it in some primates that I've heard of, but I don't think any other animal shows contagion the way we do. But tell me if he has an example.
Well, he thinks dogs show disgust to citrus fruits, which are poisonous to them because they wrinkle.
No, it's
they wrinkle. Well, they'll do it to the smell too.
Yeah, but it's just distaste. No, this is so Paul. One of the things I got from Paul Rosen, who's one of the world's experts on food and eating, the psychology of food and eating, is of course animals evolved to seek out certain sensory experiences that guide them to their food. So if you're a koala bear, if it smells like eucalyptus, you're done. But if you're a dog, you're evolved to eat meat. And when you're a kid, like you think, well, grapes are so delicious. I love grapes. Fido, why don't you like this grape? You won't eat a grape. And so that's just distaste. And so what I learned from working with Paul Rosen is distaste is very common. You're reacting to the sensory properties of the food. So that's not so interesting. What's interesting is that something that elicits a negative reaction touches something else. Will you then avoid that something else?
So he's tracked that in chimps.
Oh, contagion. Tell me, how has he shown contagion?
Well, he tracked one chimp who found a dead rat and used it to torture other chimps with.
Okay.
And so she would place the dead rat, which was in rough shape, on another chimp, possibly sleeping. The chimp would wake up, be horrified, and then rush off to clean.
That's really funny. Wow, a chimp practical joke. That is funny because my college roommate and I did something kind of like that in college. He had a snake and he had dead rats in the room to feed the snake, and we actually did something very much like that. This is a riot. Now, does that show contagion that they needed to wash off? Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, well, he does. He has other accounts in the book as well.
Where is this?
Mama's Last Hug, it's called.
Is that a book of his? I don't know that.
Yes. Mama's Last Hug.
Okay,
it's a relatively recent one. Yeah.
Check it out.
I was
DeWalt
quite
was
interested.
very influential in my thinking. Yeah, I love DeWalt. So
yeah, me too. Well, and I'm so interested in your work on disgust, and so it was interesting to me because I thought it was a relatively human emotion, but he makes a pretty strong case that it's more.
But as with so much about chimps, you can say, do they have culture? Well, you know, there's this behavior here that was observed once or 10 times. You know, that what you're telling me now is the first case I've ever heard that looks like maybe it was. So with so much about chimps, do they have it? Well, almost a little bit. And sometimes, you know, so, you know, there's not bright lines, but there are some sort of somewhat bright lines.
Well, I guess with disgust, you'd think that it was sufficiently embodied, visceral, so that it might have fairly pronounced equivalents in species that are closely related to us. I do wonder about its relationship with conscientiousness, which seems to be a more specifically human trait, perhaps. Maybe you see it in sled dogs. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I do think, so, you know, maybe you can tell me about Freud's anal triad, whether there's any truth to that. But at least if you think that human personalities, like the master dimension is sort of, are you more set towards like approach, explore mode, or are you more set to finding threats and defend mode? And that's a trait that varies. And people who are more set to defend mode are going to be more anxious, but also more disgust sensitive. There's a small correlation with politics. They tend to be a little more conservative, and conservatives certainly are more conscientious,
especially orderly. They're especially more orderly, and that seems to be more tightly associated with disgust sensitivity.
Yep, that's right.
As opposed to straight neuroticism.
Yeah.